Conversations. You've been kind enough in the past to share insight with us, and I really appreciate it. You are the president and founder of Rebel Global Security. Rebel Global Security does a lot of work with the private sector and the public sector, but you come from both sides of that. You folks have currently working with the private sector to improve security, governance, policy, and giving them a lot of direction. So the reason I reached out to you is, you wrote an article just a short time ago on the great power competition, which I want you to define. But basically, my words, not yours, calling out the private sector in terms of responding to this competition for relying too much on what you call traditional cybersecurity approaches to risk. And obviously, it's not just on cyber. You folks deal with physical security, national security. I know you were all in during the Paris Olympics of giving folks recommendations on dealing with potential risks there. So, Mark, thank you so much. And let's just start off with the broad question. How do you define great power competition, and give us some of your thoughts about what got you to craft the article to begin with?
Yeah, well, thanks, John. Thanks for having me back again. Always great to be on with you to talk about these issues. I come not out of the corporate security world, but out of the national security and foreign policy world, and so that's the lens through which I tend to view these issues. Great power competition is a concept that has been familiar to me, since my college or grad school days, when we were, studying the Cold War and all of the previous conflicts that were the templates for the Cold War. But great power competition, simply defined, is when large nations, particularly the largest nations in the world, vie for power and influence. And that can come in the form of a hot war, like we saw during the Second World War. If you go way back in history, think like Athens and Sparta, Greece and Persia, or it can come in the form of a Cold War. And obviously the most salient and recent example of that is the United States and the Soviet Union. What we've seen over the last 5, 6, 7 years is really a return of this great power competition to the global political environment. So as I talk about a little bit in the article, if you rewind the tape about the last 80 or so years of international security, going back to the end of the Second World War, you had the Cold War, and then of course you had the war on terror starting with the 9/11 attacks. And so since the turn to the 21st century, we've really been focused on that terrorism issue. And we haven't been focused on the competition between big nation states. But now, of course, we're focused on China, we're focused on Russia. Those are the two kind of chief antagonists in this great power competition. And that's created really a new international security environment. It has implications for us from a foreign policy perspective, but what I talk about in the article is it has very significant implications for private sector businesses. And to your question, I talk a lot about how we need to move beyond kind of traditional approaches to cybersecurity and physical security, and really just traditional approaches to corporate risk management, to more proactive approaches. And I think this great power competition and the implications that it has for private sector businesses is can serve as a bit of a wake-up call, as a reminder to businesses that they do need to start thinking about those issues that they may have previously relegated to the domain of Washington policy wonks, but now come with very real implications for how they're going to run their business.
How do you find the private sector's view of geopolitics in general? Because obviously, to your point, it is impactful, has been. You're going to give us some examples in a little bit, but I know you've worked with the energy sector, the financial sector, and certainly cyber or physical attacks in those areas can have and has had dramatic impact on day-to-day business. So are you finding that even though my characterization of your call out that the private sector was relying on traditional responses, that's one thing. But are you feeling that the private sector, in layman's terms, is getting it, unquote, or do they continue to need more information to be more aware of not just the response from global great power competition as you craft, but just in general, the geopolitical activity can impact day-to-day business?
I do think that the private sector is getting it now. I think that, and it's been a process. This is not a totally new concept. I mean, there's been geopolitical risk in the private sector, and an understanding of geopolitical risk in the private sector for decades. I think that the sheer speed and scale of national security and geopolitical issues that are impacting businesses is forcing some more recognition of this at the board level and within private sector companies. I think the challenge, and there have been some nascent attempts to solve this challenge, but it's early, is how a company manages these issues. And that's where I think we're definitely still in the Wild West days. As you know, John, coming out of the financial sector, when issues become mature, they're become increasingly standardized ways of handling them and treating them within companies across a given sector. So, we were just talking before we got on, right? Like Bank Protection Act, things like that. Those then start to prescribe a very particular way of handling certain issues. Geopolitics, I don't think we're there yet on any of that. And so depending on which business you're talking to, they may have a dedicated office that handles geopolitical risk. They may not. They may talk about it at the board level. They may not. It might be something that falls into the responsibilities of the security office. It might be something that falls into the responsibilities of the public affairs office, or they may have a separate intelligence unit. So that's where there's a real lack of standardization across the board. And I think that creates challenges right now in terms of just getting everybody across the private sector onto the same sheet of music and how they talk about these issues and how a company should manage these issues.
It's interesting you mentioned board involvement in our world, in the AML CFT world. There's a banking industry-wide or banking agency-wide and FinCEN proposal on changing the AML program infrastructure. And part of it is to ensure that boards of directors become much more engaged than they are today. I want to shift. One of the things you talk about, and we are well aware of the notion of enterprise risk management, but you characterize the response necessary to deal with these geopolitical and other related issues to enterprise security risk management as a starting point. Talk to us a bit about that, and then we'll, in a little bit, get you to give us your checklist on that. But describe, obviously we know just based on the phrase what it means, but what does it mean from a practical standpoint to these institutions, no matter what they are, in the financial or other industries, have an enterprise security risk management program and policy and governance structure?
Yeah, so enterprise security risk management is this concept that is really being championed by ASIS International right now. So, which is
and tell us what that is. I know, but go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. So for listeners who may not be aware, ASIS and don't quote me here. I'm doing this off the top of my head, but I would say probably largest kind of industry association dedicated to corporate security and security management. The association that doles out certifications like certified protection professional and physical security professional, and has been doing a lot of the conceptual thought leadership work around the future of security risk management in a corporate sense. And so enterprise security risk management as a concept that ASIS is touting as, I think, that kind of next evolution, how we move from a reactive kind of guns, gates, guards style approach to physical security to one that is more similar to like an enterprise risk management approach, where you're looking across the organization as a whole, you're integrating multiple security disciplines, and you are working with asset owners across an organization to help them make risk-informed decisions. So that's a big part of the emphasis is transitioning the security leadership within a company from just being kind of security guard in chief to someone who is a risk advisor to a range of business units on how they can address manage security risk to their assets. The reason that I talk about enterprise security risk management in the context of great power competition is really just because ESRM, I think, is a helpful framework for security leaders to think about driving a more holistic approach to these issues across the business. But what I would say, John, especially for your listeners, many of whom I think are probably not on that corporate security side of things, whether it's enterprise security risk management or a different framework, I think is less important than that there is a holistic and strategic framework for thinking about how big picture geopolitical issues impact the organization, and then for driving change across the organization to mitigate the risks associated with those issues.
You listed a few examples of the challenges faced by the private sector, and I called out two, one on IP theft and there was another sort of general cyber example from the past couple of years. You want to talk a little bit about those, because that's sort of driving your response to the need for more, my words, I guess, robust response to these security risks than perhaps institutions had in the past. So again, the two that, since we are in Cybersecurity Awareness Month, one is on IP theft, another one was another cyber attack.
Yeah, so the cyber example that I talked about was Volt Typhoon, which is a Chinese state-sponsored hacking group. What is interesting and unique about Volt Typhoon, in contrast to other state-sponsored hacking operations, is that Volt Typhoon is really intended to cause physical destruction and disruption in the real world. So it is part of the Chinese government's effort to plant, really the equivalent of ticking time bombs into U.S. critical infrastructure, whether that's our energy grid, our banks, our water systems, our communications technology, so that in the event that the United States and China go to war over Taiwan, for example, that the Chinese government can flip a switch to sow significant discord here in the homeland. Volt Typhoon's gotten a lot of press, and there's a lot of talk about it, but I think that even with all the press, it's hard for people who may not spend all day thinking about this stuff like I do, to conceptualize that we really are here. This is where we are in the movie right now, where we have these very capable strategic adversaries, hostile nation states, who have already planted malware within IT networks here in the homeland to create these types of effects. So, and of course, should go without saying, all those critical infrastructures that I mentioned, vast majority of them are privately owned and operated. So those aren't government networks that are being compromised; they're private sector networks. And then the IP theft example was an example from Google, where they had an engineer who was working on artificial intelligence for Google and was indicted by the Justice Department earlier this year for exfiltrating AI trade secrets from Google and providing them to the Chinese. And so that's, one of just a myriad examples where you have this kind of wholesale compromise of American intellectual property that's just being jettisoned back over to China to support China's strategic military and geopolitical aims. So you're really seeing this effort across the board by the Chinese government to undermine the United States, undermine the West, to steal information that could be of use to them in growing their power and challenging the United States for global hegemony, and then also planting the seeds for potential disruptive operations should they need to go there.
We didn't talk about this, but I know you must have a view on this. When you mentioned the Google situation, and we've seen similar cases where insiders have, in some cases in the States with banks, insiders are simply committing fraud and stealing value. But in that case, obviously getting important information back to China. Do you guys have recommendations on what I would call more improved HR vetting or due diligence? I realize that's not the scope of our conversation, but I have to think that if I'm coming to you for some help on trying to figure out my risks, that's a risk too, right? Who you bring in. So just high level, obviously we haven't had a chance to talk about this, but are there things that jump out at you that companies should be considering besides what they normally do? Because people are getting through the cracks in some cases, even if people have robust HR systems. But what strikes you when you see something like that? And we're not trying to point a finger at Google, but we're trying to say this can happen. What would lead you to go to a company like that or others and say, hey, in your HR department, remember to do A, B, and C, if that makes any sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the question is, do you or do you not have an insider threat program? And for many companies, unfortunately, the answer is still no. Right. For the companies where the answer is yes, there's a pretty wide range of maturity with those insider threat programs. If you have a good insider threat program, and what I'd point listeners to is if you just Google CISA, CISA, Insider Threat Mitigation Guide, that's a pretty comprehensive document, free, publicly available, put out by the Department of Homeland Security, that walks you through how to build an insider threat program. And it's a great resource. I mean, I was consulting on these issues before CISA put that out, and we were providing a lot of the same recommendations and information at a significant cost to clients. So the fact that it's now free and publicly available is great, and companies should leverage it. And to your point, John, part of that insider threat program would be working on the pre-screening and vetting before folks come in the door. That's an essential piece of it. That's getting more and more challenging as we've moved to remote work, and we're hiring people without ever meeting them in person. There are large pretty significant schemes run by the North Koreans, for example, to get North Korean workers hired into American companies via virtual interviews, masking their national identity. And there have been a number of DOJ actions related to that you can look up online. But yeah, I mean, there are a range of actions that a company can take, all of which I think kind of fall under the rubric of an insider threat program. And then one thing I'd add to that is, yes, insider threat covers the gamut, everything from somebody who accidentally clicks on a link. Is technically considered an insider threat. It's just sort of a negligent or complacent insider, but then all the way across the threat spectrum to individuals who are working on behalf of adversarial governments. And that's where you want to look at, if you're ready to kind of move up the maturity scale, not only do we have an insider threat program, but we also might have a counterintelligence program. Mm-hmm. And the key difference in my mind between those things is that insider threat is a program to identify risk indicators of a whole range of behaviors, basically to flag people in the system so that you can have an investigator take another look at them. A counterintelligence program goes one step farther to actually integrate a deeper understanding of the tactics and procedures that are being employed by adversarial intelligence services like Russian intelligence and Chinese intelligence. And then you're baking that in to your mitigation measures and your training and awareness programs as well.
Well, that's super helpful. The item we want to go back to, you mentioned the enterprise security risk management, and in the article you go through a checklist. So give us that checklist, and then any other recommendations that you have to deter or at least report cyber-enabled and other attacks by China and Russia.
Yeah, so the idea with the checklist is to take about an hour of time. That's what I recommend in the article, and work through this checklist of questions around how your organization may be impacted or be drawn into this great power competition between the United States and China and Russia. And so the items on that checklist include, it's very strategic, very high level, but basically mission and vision, which is looking at what the mission of your organization is, what industry you operate in, what products or services you provide, and what the relationship of those things to this geopolitical environment may be. Core values, which is the reason to look at core values is really that we're moving from a world where businesses could really kind of operate independently from politics, global politics, to a world where they're becoming ensnared in global politics, particularly if you have supply chains running through China. And so it's an opportune time to look at your core values, because you may need to pick a side on certain issues, and determine how closely you're going to align yourself with Washington's policies. We also suggest people look at their operating environment. That's a more granular look at where they have physical assets, where they have logical assets, whether those are domestic or overseas, where their supply chains run through, and assess the geopolitical risk that's associated with that. And then we suggest that people map their stakeholders. So these are the internal stakeholders that are everybody from legal and HR and security to comms and government relations and public affairs and risk management. Understanding all of those stakeholders who may have a piece in addressing these big strategic cyber and related security challenges, and then external stakeholders. So those are principally the national security agencies and other, federal, state, and local agencies that you may want to work with, as well as industry associations. Increasingly, I think, play a role in this space. And then finally, we encourage folks to look at their risk management cycle, and that's just how do you assess and mitigate, and then continuously improve your approach to risk management, and how are you baking in these kind of big picture geopolitical and cyber issues into that risk management cycle.
I just finished a book by Stephen Brill called The Death of Truth, and he talks about the social media and the internet and disinformation, and I'm wondering what role that plays to the awareness level of geopolitical issues for corporations. So like, I'm not asking you to recommend certain source material, but I have to think, like we talked about with HR, I have to think another way to do your assessment is to say, we're going to make decisions as a private sector entity. As you were saying before, you got to try to figure out, are you going to be connected to government policy or what have you? But similarly with just information, there's so much information out there, and some of it is valuable. A lot of it's not, my view. What do you recommend when you're talking to CEO and you're saying to the CEO, okay, we're going to do a risk assessment, enterprise security management risk assessment of your company for you. And so you need to be on top of geopolitical issues so that you could make informed decisions on where to put resources, the training, whatever it is. How much does the abundance of misinformation impact that, if at all? And then maybe a broader question is, where do you recommend people get their information? Obviously, they can go to Homeland Security websites, FBI website, all that kind of stuff, which makes a ton of sense. So you get that information when guidance comes out, your former agency, State Department, all that kind of stuff. But I have to think that that's a challenge. If you opened up this company 10 years ago, that wasn't on the table, but it's clearly on the table now. So, not asking you to be political, but just in terms of being practical, what do you do with that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think that for all of the concern about mis and disinformation, and it's valid, the benefit of having the company now as opposed to 10 or maybe 20 or 30 years ago is you do have an amazing amount of information. And so if you can filter things appropriately and you know how to have some sense about you and avoid the mis and disinformation, the sheer quantity of data at your fingertips that's free and publicly available is just amazing. And so and I often say that when I was in government, I'm not sure that the quality and quantity of information that I had was that much better than what's available on the open web. It just sort of maybe had gone through more layers of vetting, to your point, John. So what I'd say is this. The biggest thing is to triangulate information. So, and that's corroborating information with more than a single source. Typically, when we're advising companies at a strategic level, that's really not that much of a challenge. What it is that sometimes an executive will see a piece of information that comes with some questionable sourcing. Maybe it's on social media, and then we're pretty quickly able to say, we need to dismiss that. We need to put that off to the side. But generally speaking, at a strategic level, you're able to, I think, triangulate it and say, okay, we're seeing this reported by, if we're taking mainstream media, we're seeing this reported by the Times, and we're seeing it reported by CNN, and we're seeing it reported by Fox News, and so we're getting some validation from our own sources. Whereas if you just see a random tweet, that I think you gotta be just kind of always have your antenna up to say, I'm not sure I'm going to put any credence in that whatsoever. And then the next additional levels, I would say, yes, or the government provided information is very valuable. And then having those relationships with government agencies so that you can pick up the phone, which we do a lot, to call folks, whether it's at DoD or state or Homeland, to just get the kind of inside truth there about what they're seeing to validate what we're seeing in the open source.
Yeah, I just think that came to mind, not just because of all the concern about this, but the recent hurricanes and some of the misinformation about FEMA and all that kind of stuff. But your points are very well taken. All right, I'll get you out of here on this. You've obviously, again, my words, called out the private sector to kind of sit back and revisit how they're handling and responding to these security challenges. How optimistic are you that there's going to be a lot of, not support's the wrong word, but open-mindedness of the private sector to, we always need to keep learning. So this is another valuable timeout we should have and maybe make some adjustments. How optimistic are you that there'll be some improvement throughout various industries? I know you guys deal with a number of them.
I'm optimistic about it. I think that, I started this company 2 years ago, and I think that I've seen a major change within those 2 years, just in terms of the level of understanding and appreciation from the private sector that geopolitics and national security is something that they need to be actively engaged in and wrap their minds around and start to build business strategies that account for those issues. So I'm optimistic about it. And I think, as we head into this election season and into whatever 2025 may bring, I think the understanding in the private sector that what's happening in Washington matters, and then what's happening in other capitals around the world matters, is just going to continue to grow in importance.
Mark Freedman, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you joining me for a second time, and would urge people to take a look at your website and your article that appeared, I believe, in Security Watch?
Security Info Watch, yep.
Yep. And obviously other articles on both physical and cyber security. So thank you so much for your time and sharing your insights.
Thanks, John. Happy to be here.